Today we are visiting the archives and special collections of UMass Dartmouth in Dartmouth, located 24 miles to the OCHM's southeast. But first, a little history about the campus. UMass Dartmouth traces its roots back to 1895, a time when 3 state-run textile schools were chartered, 2 of them locally. The 2 schools located here in the Old Colony were the New Bedford Textile School and the Bradford Durfee Textile School in Fall River. The third, by the way, was in Lowell. Both schools grew throughout the years, expanding in both size and in their curricula, and the 2 parallel paths ultimately came together in 1960, when, by an act of the legislature, the 2 schools were merged to create Southeastern Massachusetts Technological Institute, or SMTI. Both schools remained in operation while SMTI was built from the ground up. Trustees chose a site for the campus from 740 acres of woodland and farmland in North Dartmouth, a site easily accessible by car and partway between both New Bedford and Fall River. SMTI's first president, Joseph Leo Driscoll, was appointed in 1962. The state hired the architectural firm of Desmond and Lord of Boston to serve as the architect of record for the SMTI project, and they hired Paul Rudolph to design the campus. The groundbreaking for the new campus took place on June 14, 1964, and 2 years later, the school celebrated both the dedication of the first academic building and the graduation of the first 219 SMTI students. In 1991, a new University of Massachusetts structure combined the Amherst, Boston, and Worcester campuses and the SMTI, at this time known as Southeastern Massachusetts University, and the University of Lowell into one system, resulting in the University of Massachusetts Dartmouth, the name by which the school is still known today. True to its history, UMass Dartmouth continues to adapt and change with the times, and recent decades have been marked by continued development of the campus and the enhancement of the university's reach into the local community. Today, the school has 387 full-time faculty, students from 47 states and 56 countries, and nearly 55,000 alumni around the world. Our tour today takes us to the archives and special collections of the Clare T. Carney Library, which was designed by architect Paul Rudolph to be the center of the campus. Rudolph, then dean of Yale's School of Art and Architecture, was one of the leading architects in the country during the 1950s and 60s. In addition to the unique individual buildings Rudolph designed, one of his major achievements was the overall master plan for the campus. Rudolph brought to life his ideas about art and architecture, believing in both the importance of large-scale construction, as well as the minute details of classrooms and stairways, and of course, the overall relationship between the two. It is now our pleasure, as we continue to explore the fascinating history of the Old Colony, to take you on a tour of the Clare T. Carney Library Archives and Special Collections, which can be accessed via the Ferreira-Mendes Portuguese American Archives entrance on the side of the library building.
Hi, I'm Sonia Pacheco, and I'm the archivist for the Ferreira-Mendes Portuguese American Archives, which is actually a collection in the Archives and Special Collections Department at the Clare T. Carney Library at the University of Massachusetts Dartmouth. So what is the difference between the Ferreira-Mendes Portuguese American Archives and the Archives and Special Collections Department? Well, the FMPAA, as we informally call it, because it's a mouthful to say the whole entire name all the time, or the Portuguese American Archive, is what we call a collecting mandate within our department. What's a collecting mandate? It is an intentional grouping of subjects, topics that we actively collect materials on, and specifically archival materials. Archival materials can be anything that are created or generated by a person, place, or institution. So we have everything from photographs to personal letters to general correspondence of businesses to, we have lots of video of community events. We've got posters from community events. We also have some business records. And I do have to admit that we do have some objects which are not traditional to archives, but that are representative of individuals' experience as either first or second generation Portuguese Americans. So as part of documenting that history, we've collected them. I actually have a wine barrel underneath my desk, and it's underneath my desk because it's I haven't found the appropriate place to store it. But when folks see that wine barrel, they immediately tell me a story about remembering their grandfather making homemade wine, or even themselves telling me about the grape harvest or their own winemaking process. The FerreiraMendes Portuguese American Archives document the experiences of Portuguese American immigration and its descendants. What that means is that we collect materials, the historical record, of how Portuguese immigrants settled and how they've lived their lives since they arrived in the United States. We have a limited amount of materials related, specifically related to Portugal, and those materials are here as part of bigger immigrant collections. And because we're an archive, we don't generally collect books either. So Archives and Special Collections at the Clarity Carney Library has 13 collecting mandates, and those collecting mandates, I won't list them all because there are many, but our better known ones are the Ferreira-Mendes Portuguese American Archives, the Howard Glasser Folk Music Collection, the RFK Assassination Archive, the Congressman Barney Frank Archive, and the UMass Dartmouth Archive. So those tend to be the ones that are most frequently used. And then we also have a small local history materials collection that is mostly comprised of books. We have not proactively sought out local collection archival content so far. Things may change in the future, and they likely will change. Archives and Special Collections is a department within the Clarity Carney Library. We're one of 6 departments, and our focus is, like the title says, Archives and Special Collections, which differentiates us from the general collection, which is available to the general public and can be checked out. Anything within Archives and Special Collections must be used in-house. Our reading room is open to the general public. You do not have to be affiliated with the campus. And our hours are usually Monday through Friday, 9:30 to 5. Taking into account the current pandemic situation, those hours may change based on staffing. So I'll be showcasing or talking about some of our collections. It would be impossible to talk about everything that we have here in the archive in the very generous amount of time that I've been given. So these are not necessarily our most important or our best materials, but more so a demonstration that we document the lived experiences and the everyday life of Portuguese Americans, which goes from politicians like Edmund Denise to, we'll be seeing some very humble working class examples of the Portuguese experience, because it ranges from both perspectives and it behooves us to tell the whole story, not just the well-known story or the well-known individual story. So within this particular cabinet, we have a small sample of the documents of the Edmund Denise Portuguese American Political, Legal, and Public Service Collection. That is a very long name. Most of our collections don't have such a long name. However, this was an endowed collection, so there were some specifications we had to meet, and this was at the request of the donor. Donor requests mean an awful lot. So Edmund Denise was a local politician. He was American-born to first-generation Portuguese parents. And he rose to the position, he was elected to the position of District Attorney for Bristol County. For those of a certain age, You may recognize his name because he was actually one of the district attorneys during the Chappaquiddick trial, and he was a professional and personal acquaintance of the Kennedys, which is something that will always get brought up with when speaking about Edmund Denise. However, what many people don't know is that Edmund, after his political career ended, went on to own a radio station that he purchased in the mid-70s that to this day still exists. And it is a Portuguese station, WJFD, that has the highest frequency of all Portuguese language radio stations in I'm going to say in the East Coast. So his legacy still lives on. And within his collection, we have everything from personal photographs to some campaign materials. He served in the military, so we've got some of his military service documents. And Edmund was a huge proponent and advocate of Portuguese American history. So he was actually one of the leaders in the campaign to recognize Peter Francisco as a Portuguese American, and had a substantial hand in the placement of markers along the east and west coasts of the United States of where the Portuguese were known to have had a presence prior to the 20th century. Another example of the kinds of collections we have here in the Portuguese American Archives is this one of Dr. Stephen Cabral, and his collection is specifically called the Dr. Stephen Cabral Personal and Professional Papers. Dr. Cabral is an anthropologist, sociologist, photographer, historian. He officially taught anthropology and sociology. And his research interest through the extent of his whole career, which spanned over 35 years, was the concept of feasting. And he, because he's an anthropologist as well as being a sociologist, he used photography as a primary means of capturing the feasting, and then he analyzed it and extrapolated and did all sorts of academic things to the data that he was collecting. So what we have within his collection are not only his teaching materials, his class syllabi, we've got some student assignments as well, but also his personal papers. We also have the extent of his photograph collection, which I believe at last count was somewhere over 5,000 photographs. In this exhibit case, we have a very, very small sample, as you can tell if we have over 5,000 photographs, of some of the feasting photographs that he took. Now, while his professional interest was specifically on Portuguese American feasting, he also documented other kinds of feasting and did some really interesting comparative work. One of the other feasts that he covered was Native American feasting, which is exemplified through the photographs in this middle cabinet. And specifically in the area of Louisiana. So there's some interesting conversation around the concept of Creole and Native American communities, and then an immigrant community with the Portuguese American community specifically. Dr. Cabral photographed feasts both in the United States and Portugal, and he did some interesting comparative work of the same of feasts celebrating the same saint, but in two different geographies, and how those were expressed in different ways. So, like I mentioned before, the Portuguese American Archives documents the lived experience of Portuguese Americans, not only the well-known politicians, but also the everyday man. The family that worked in the textile mills, the family that had a farm in Dartmouth. Something I haven't mentioned yet, but that I will do so now because it applies to both of the things I'm going to be talking to you about right now, is our mandate is actually national. So we collect Portuguese American history in the United States. We are not focused only on the history of the Portuguese Americans in Fall River or Dartmouth, Fall River being usually what is assumed that we do. We also don't just document the Azorean experience, but the Portuguese experience. So anybody who traveled from the country of Portugal, may it be the mainland, the Azorean archipelago, the Madeiran archipelago, to the United States. So in these two cabinets are examples of materials that were important to everyday Portuguese Americans, from belonging to a fraternal association, which was a key component of life in the late 19th, early 20th century, where things like there was no American Social Security net. If you were injured on the job, belonging to a fraternal association meant that you had a little bit of financial assistance. You went to your doctor, they issued you a medical document saying so-and-so is sick. You presented that to the association you belonged to, and then they would send you a weekly amount of money, kind of like our workers' compensation works today. So in this cabinet, we have examples of not only photographs of fraternal dinner parties, but also of the rules and guidelines of a number of fraternal societies in the United States, as well as some of the member badges that were worn, and you'll get to see some of those in greater detail. The other materials that we have here within the archive are family photographs. Very often donors won't feel comfortable or no longer have materials such as letters or family correspondence, but there may be a photograph or two that they still have from their grandfather, from their grandmother, or even from their great-grandmother and their great-grandfather. And we will happily take photographs of pioneer immigrant families or even present day immigrant families, because the photograph really does tell an interesting story, not only who was gathering with whom, but what they were wearing, what they were eating. There's a lot of history that can be told through a photograph. So we have those here as well. We also have some material objects that have come in as part of collections, things like baptismal gowns and small objects that have significant and emotional importance for the family. And how can we talk about Portuguese Americans without talking about food? Because we love to eat and we're really good cooks. Well, some of us are anyways. So one of the things we collect here within the Portuguese American Archive are cookbooks. And this is an intentional collection item because many Portuguese American recipes have been derived from Portuguese recipes, from traditional Portuguese recipes, and there's been some ingredients added in, some localized cooking processes that were not traditional to Portugal have been utilized, and it's both historically interesting to trace those, but also academically interesting to trace those as well, and how the differences have happened. An example of how a collecting mandate like this has been utilized in the greater academic world is that we were actually part of a research project funded by the Gulbenkian Institute in the European Union to document how some of those changes between Portuguese food and Portuguese American food came about. This was a project we did in collaboration with an academic researcher from Wales. So one of the examples of how there can be many recipes for a single dish is rice pudding, which is something that most Portuguese Americans have eaten, and that many Americans have eaten as well. That can be exemplified in this particular middle cabinet here, middle shelf here, where we've got about 7 recipes, all showing different variations of rice pudding. Something else that we've had on display is kale soup, because kale soup, at least for me, is a tenuous topic where I have very specific ideas. Historically, but both professionally, of what kale soup should be, and then when you start to look through the recipe books, you see many variations that you're like, how did this come about? So at the moment, we've got over 40 to 50 cookbooks. Many of them are local, small, private publications, which is one of the reasons why the archive is particularly interested in getting a copy of those books, because very often they are not available to the open public, to the open market. So it behooves us to keep them as part of the historical record for future generations to be able to consult and research in the future. And we can't talk about documenting Portuguese American immigration without actually talking about immigration records and immigration history. So here's my Portuguese American immigration history lesson in a minute or less. The Portuguese came to the United States in what are informally known as two waves. Some historians, sociologists would argue three. I am of the personal opinion that they happened in two. So you have the first wave, which accounts for the whaling industry, specifically to the coasts, New Bedford, San Diego being the two locations that are most frequently cited. And that lasted until about the 1880s. Immediately following the whaling industry, we have the textile industry, specifically in New England, where we have a large number of individuals migrating specifically from the Azores at this point in large numbers to the New England area to work in the textile mills. They settle in places like New Bedford, Fall River, Lowell, Lawrence to work in the mills. And that lasts until roughly 1921, where the U.S. changes its immigration policy and literacy becomes a requirement. So that makes the numbers of individuals who are able to enter the country drop somewhat significantly. And then it almost stops altogether in 1924 with the full implementation of the Quota Act, as the law is informally known, where each country is allotted a specific number of allowed immigrants based upon the 1880 census. Portugal is given a number in the vicinity of 700 individuals, which is next to nothing when we account for the fact that anywhere between 20 to 30,000 individuals were arriving each year prior to that. And so informally, we say that immigration from Portugal pretty much stopped between 1924 to about 1965, when what is informally known as the Family Reunification Act is implemented. The act was written into law in 65. It was actually not implemented until 67. And that is when the second wave starts. Now, some of you may be saying, wait a second, but I've heard about the Azorean Refugee Act, or I've heard about the volcano eruption in the island of Fayal that allowed individuals to arrive. Yes, that did happen. So in 1958, there was a volcanic eruption in the island of Fayal in the Azores, and a little known politician by the name of JFK, who was very familiar with the local community, was able to get into law what is known as the Azorean Refugee Act, which allowed individuals that had been affected by the volcanic eruption to come to the United States as refugees, because again, there were refugee quotas in place at the time. Now, it is unknown exactly how many individuals traveled to the United States from the Azores on those refugee visas. The number is estimated anywhere between 4,000 to 5,000, which is not a significant number of individuals when we account for the fact that there had, prior to 1924, there had been anywhere between 20 to 25,000 arriving on a yearly basis. However, when we think about the fact that in 1965, the immigration laws change, it means that we have a group of newly arrived individuals who still have firmly established familiar bonds in the Azores, who are able to become American citizens, and in Portuguese do what is called the carta de chamada, the calling letter, a sponsorship visa, for their family members. And thus begins the second wave of migration, which informally lasts until about 1988 when Portugal enters the European Union. So, in the Portuguese American Archives, we have a number of immigration records, predominantly Portuguese passports, that document both aspects of both waves. The thing to know about Portuguese immigration, Portuguese immigration, and American immigration, so the departure of individuals from Portugal and the entering of individuals into the United States, is that the U.S. had very fluid laws up until 1924. You didn't require a passport to enter the country. There was a number of questions that you had to answer at a port of entry. However, in order to leave Portugal, you needed government authorization. You specifically needed a passport that you had to pay for, and you needed authorization to leave the country with that passport. Hence why we have a large number of Portuguese issued passports that allow us to document the departure of individuals from the country rather than documentation demonstrating individuals entering the United States.